This is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to interview Mr. Clarence Jones. He has an extensive experience working with civil rights movement in the United States. He has not only been a witness of the human rights movement, but a protagonist of it. He actually had the wonderful opportunity to work hand in hand with Dr. Martin Luther King. In fact, I think he has so many experience to tell us, to the university and the students here, about, for example, he helped Martin Luther King to write his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." So it's really wonderful to have him today. I truly believe that as Latin Americans, we can learn so much about the civil rights movement in the United States, about the struggle, about the tactics, about the strategies, their victories, and sometimes always when they were also losing. There is so much that we can learn about race equality also here from the Latin American side. So just let me start with that and say once again that it's really wonderful to be able to talk and to have a debate with Dr. Clarence.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor for me to have an opportunity to share my experiences with you. You may not know, maybe Jonathan knows, he does not know, but for many, many years, notwithstanding the different successor governments after Pinochet, I have, Chile has always been on my not popular list. I know more than most Americans about what happened under the Pinochet government. I met several years ago a person here at Stanford at the time. He was the youngest member of the Pinochet cabinet, and he described to me and others personally his witness as the troops came in killing members. He hid himself. Most of the people were killed. So I'm not telling, I know, as they say in the United States, that's part of your history, but it's part of my history, only to the extent that I know that my government and the counterintelligence agency under Secretary of State Kissinger enabled that, sponsored that, and made that possible, and made so many, brought such havoc to Chilean democracy. So now that I got that off my chest, of course, Chile, at one point years ago, I was an investment banker advisor to the government of Zambia, a copper producing state. And I used to study Chile's copper production in relationship to the other copper producing countries of the world. You have a great country. You have a country like others in South America, I'll say Latin America, who are struggling and have struggled to have democracy and democratic values. I was fortunate. I was a young man. I'm going to be 90 years old in January, in about 4 months from now. But when I was 29 years old, in February of 1960, I met Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time. He was 31. And for the next 7.5 years, until the date of his assassination, I worked with him initially as a political advisor, then as his personal lawyer and speechwriter, up until the very day in which he was assassinated. So all of you, or many of you, know the history of that event. But let me share with you something that you may not know, or something I think I can tell you because of the role that I played. You may not be able to fully understand or interpret from the books that you read about the United States and the Civil Rights Movement, notwithstanding the number of facts that you may know about what occurred during this place in Montgomery, Alabama, and the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the various things. But generically, you have to look at what occurred in 1960 through 1970 particularly. You have to look at that as the fundamental political and transformative epoch in the history of the United States. No matter what someone may tell you or what you may read, I am here to tell you, I'm now, and I have been, I'm an adjunct professor, and I have been a scholar for several years, and I think I have a reasonably good understanding and knowledge of the history of the United States. So I don't want you to have any illusions or misinterpretation. The government of the United States, the country of the United States was founded and created on the legacy of slavery, period. There's no amount of other facts. Now we live in an era in which I never heard of anything called alternative facts. I never heard of anything called alternative facts. I mean, it sounds like you're going back to Galileo and, the earth is either flat or the earth is round. There are facts, but there are no alternative facts. So as a consequence of that, a companion to that institution was a legacy of white supremacy. And we had a civil war in 1860. And the Civil War was it was only over one issue, notwithstanding what other things you may read about. It was only on the issue as to whether or not the institution of slavery would be continued or ended. But that institution and the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction from 1866 to 1877, in an effort to implement what was the Civil War was about, ending slavery, the passage of what we have certain amendments to our Constitution of the United States, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. All of those were intended to enshrine the victory on the battlefield under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln and his subsequent presidency after he was assassinated of Andrew Johnson. So we have been wrestling with this since that time until now. And as a consequence of that internal struggle with how to overcome that institution, that has had an impact into the 19th and 20th century. And so in the 20th century, notwithstanding we had a civil war, there was still this practice, particularly in over half of our country at least, of racial segregation. That is, laws that required by law, laws that were enforced by state police and by courts, the separation of races, the separation of Black people and white people because of the color of their skin. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many people before him opposed this, but he, as a young man in 1960, earlier in 1955, when he led something called the Montgomery Bus Boycott, sought to call the nation's attention that we have to end this racial segregation. And so that the civil rights movement, as you understand it, and people outside the United States movement, was a transformative political and social movement to enable the country to reclaim the values upon which it was originally founded. And Dr. King happened to have been at that time one of the more publicly known figures. But as you know, in the death of a recent Congressman, John Lewis, and others, there were many other persons. He did inspire John Lewis and others to carry on the struggle. And so that's where we are in the United States today. We're still wrestling with this. The struggle is not ended, although I am surprised that it still continues and endures as long as it has. So I would hope, and I do believe the United States can still be an exemplar, a beacon of light. Our political social movement has been very important. But also we looked at, we looked at political social movements in Europe and Latin America. I mean, the struggle of the people in your country and in Argentina and other countries of Latin America. To be free is unique and historic to your own geographic and political institutions. As the great French writer Émile Zola said, more powerful than the march of mighty armies is an idea whose time has come, ending racial discrimination, ending class discrimination, ending sex discrimination. These are ideas whose time has come. And while I am pleased and honored to be looked upon as, I guess as a relic of something, as an old remaining dinosaur from that era, we are not unmindful of the unique struggle that has occurred not only in Chile, but in other South American countries, reaffirming what I said. Émile Zola said, more powerful than the march of mighty armies is an idea whose time has come. What is that idea? The idea of individual freedom, the idea that people should be judged on their values and not by some arbitrary set of state-imposed criteria having nothing to do with the self-worth of an individual. So Jonathan Greenberg, my colleague, knows that I sometimes get infected with the civil rights disease of being a preacher. I'm not a preacher, I'm a lawyer. So I want to restrain myself from talking at you. I apologize if you think I don't want to do that. I want to talk with you.
I truly, and I'm really enjoying this. I am a fan of the civil rights movement in the United States. I've been reading about it. I normally watch documentaries, I watch speeches, because I truly believe that from Latin America, there is so much to learn from that movement. And yes, because we have similar struggles, we're also struggling still for social justice. Oh. So I very much think that we should share experience.
Yes.
And this is an opportunity actually to do that. So this is why I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Martin Luther King's speech, because I think from my point of view, his very famous speech, I Have a Dream speech, which you actually helped to write, so you can tell us a little bit more about that in particular. I think it's a speech that is very cosmopolitan in nature, because it speaks to everyone, not just Americans, people from the United States, but also to the rest of the world, because it speaks about emancipation. It speaks about social justice around the world. It speaks about the constant struggle for equality, that the march continues. It's just such a wonderful and inspiring speech for everyone. So my question is, can you tell us a little bit more about how was the speech done?
First of all, just to factually put it in his historical perspective, there's a repetitive reference by you and others about my contribution to his speech. My contribution to his speech is limited to the first 7 paragraphs. And that occurred because the March on Washington occurred on August 28th, which was a Wednesday in 1963. And Dr. King and his wife had come down 2 or 3 days ahead of time to stay in Washington. And he was staying at a hotel, the Willard, W-I-L-L-A-R-D, the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., and I was staying at the same hotel. So on a Tuesday evening, the night before the speech, some of his closest advisors got in touch with me, knowing that Dr. King was at the hotel, insisted that they wanted to have a last-minute conversation with Dr. King before his speech the following day. Dr. King was resistant, but I persuaded him that he should meet with them. So we met. Anyway, after that speech, he took he listened and so forth, and took notes on what they suggested. I don't want to use this valuable time to talk about that event. I want to talk about the speech. And then we were staying at the hotel, so we're going up in the elevator together. Now, I knew, because I had worked with him so closely, and I knew because we had talked about the fact that there was going to be this March on Washington, and he was going to have to speak. And so it's not as if that was the first time we talked about what he might say. What he might say, we had talked about a couple of times, but on that night, the night before, knowing, I just knew how his mind worked. So I said to Martin, I said, I know you've been working on some of your remarks that we've talked about over the past weeks and before. And so I handed him a yellow pad that had some writings which I had written for him. And I said, what this is, I've written a suggested opening of how you might start the speech. You can use it or not, because I often work with him, and that's what I did. And I said, you can use it, discard it, or whatever. So it's not until I heard him speak the following day, that's when, as I listened to him very carefully speak, I said to somebody, I said, oh my God, I'm thinking to my own self, he must have been very tired. And he decided to use, so the first 7 paragraphs of his speech, he used what I had drafted, and then he added on to what I had drafted, his own material, and so forth. But what is not generally known, most of the speech, 80% of the speech, after what I had written and after his own additions, was extemporaneous. He put the written text aside because his favorite gospel singer was sitting on the platform, and she yelled at him while he was reading his text. This Negro black woman gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, she just shouted out to him, Martin, tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream. Now, she had heard Dr. King use the phrase, I have a dream, but in a different context, at a speech earlier in June in Detroit at a place called Cobalt Hall. She had heard him. Apparently she thought it was an impressive thing, but it didn't, I wasn't there, but I heard about the speech, but it didn't have, however he used it, in June 21st in Detroit, it didn't have the same impact he had at the March on Washington. So he took, when she said, tell him about the dream, Martin, he took the written text, of which he'd already spoken the paragraphs that I told you about, you know. Well, what I didn't tell you was that in my first 7 paragraphs, I wrote that we are gathered here today, 100 years. We're gathered here today at the foot of the great emancipator, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And we talked, and I wrote some other things and said, but we're here to redeem a check, to cash a check and redeem a promissory note that has come back unpaid for insufficient funds. So we cannot believe there are not sufficient funds in the vault of justice of this country for so and so. That's the way it went on. But after that written text, the speech was completely as he spoke. And so I have to tell you, I had seen and heard Dr. King speak many times. You know, as I said, I met him in 1960. So this is 1963. So I'd seen him. I listened to him. But it is as if I wanted to get metaphysical or spiritual, it is as if something had taken over his body. It is as if some cosmic force has just come down and taken over. It's the same person. It's the same body, same Martin Luther King Jr., but I couldn't believe the power. I couldn't believe it was like the words were so just unbelievably compelling. They were just like, I mean, you know, I come from the biblical Christian tradition, so maybe the only thing I can talk about maybe was the Sermon on the Mount, I don't know, in the Christian Bible. But the point is, it was mesmerizing. Not so much, actually, by its content. Its content was sort of, it was good. But it was the form of the delivery, okay? Now, I don't want to disappoint or disabuse some of the people, you or those people listening. And I'm not in any way trying to denigrate or downgrade the importance of his I Have a Dream speech. But in my opinion, it was a great speech. But if I had to bookend his life of his speeches, I would not make the I Have a Dream speech part of the bookend. I would not make it a bookend, I'd make part of the speech. The two most important documents spoken and written by Dr. King was a letter from the Birmingham Jail written in April 1963 and his speech the night before he was assassinated. I'm sorry, strike that. Not that speech. And the speech 1 year to the date before he was assassinated, on April 4th, 1967, when he first publicly opposed the war in Vietnam. His opposition, his public speech opposing the war in Vietnam and his letter from the Birmingham jail were the two. They were like Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto in 1848. They transformed. You know, they were like Emil Zola Berman's 6,000 word letter to the president of the firm called J'accuse when they were trying to frame a Jewish colonel in France. But having said that, there is still something so powerful about the event. At that time, August 28, he had 250 to 275,000 people assembled in one place, one time, the largest assemblage of Black and white people in the history of the United States at that time. No cell phones, no internet and so forth. 25% of the audience there was white, right? So someone said to me, Dr. Jones, what do you think if you had available to you the cell phones and the internet and the computer and laptops? We had 5 million people. 5 million people, without a doubt, would have showed up if we had had this technology that we have today. Okay, so I want to remind you, people listening to me, historically in the United States, that gathering at that place at that time on August 28th was the largest assemblage of people in one place at the same time in the history of the United States.
Can I ask one more question about the civil rights movement, and then we move on to the current state of race relations in the U.S.?
Ask me anything you wish.
Thank you. So, in my view, one of the great achievements of the movement, of the civil rights movement in the United States, was the Voting Rights Act.
Yes.
In fact, former President Barack Obama spoke largely about the right to vote during the eulogy of John Lewis, the recent eulogy. It was actually a very powerful eulogy from the side of President Obama, but very much focused on that, on how hard it was to conquer the right to vote. So I would like to ask you your take on that, especially because today in the United States, and also in Chile is the same case, many young people refrain actually to exercise their right. So if you can enlighten us about the importance of gaining that right.
Okay. First of all, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, as you described, a very historically powerful piece of civil rights legislation, followed by the earlier Civil Rights Act of 1964. That Voting Rights Act, it dramatically occurred, of course, shortly after the events on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and that is not to be diminished or subordinated. But in a historical perspective, the struggle for the right to vote occurred earlier than 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It occurred in many places throughout the South. Many generally unknown heroes, people like Reverend Vernon. There were a lot of people that you would not know that predated that event. I saw people personally go and try to vote and be knocked down by the police. Reverend C.T. Vivian, who died the same day as John Lewis died, he was knocked down more than once as he tried to leave a voting rights demonstration. So the effort to get the right to vote was a series of protests, culminating in the one that got the most public attention. Okay, and it defines what was intended after the Civil War. Okay, it was defined. The Civil War was to end slavery, but also to ensure and protect citizenship, and in the 15th Amendment to guarantee the right to vote. Okay. Now I don't want to pontificate or to lecture to you or to anybody listening. Okay. But I say to anybody here in the United States, and maybe there's a similar analogy in Chile, I don't know if you have the opportunity to vote. I don't know. Tell me what is more important. I love champagne, okay? I understand that Chile has great wine, okay? Has great things. There is nothing more important in your country, in your culture. There's nothing more important in my country, in my culture, in my political system than the right to vote. Nothing. Nothing. Not all the copper you have in your minds, not all the political military power in the United States, because voting is power. Voting is power. As I said, more powerful than the march of mighty armies is an idea whose time has come. Voting. Anyone in Chile or any country, but anybody in the United States who says, well, I'm tired, it's too hard, and so forth, you know. I have in my older age become, colloquially in the United States, what we call a pain in the butt. Okay? I will not even tolerate. I won't permit any, except I teach, for example, I tell my students, now if you are voting registration age and you have not registered to vote, don't even come to my class. Don't even talk to me. Okay? And if you tell me that you have a voter registration card and I see you walking on the campus and I know that voting has occurred, I'm going to ask you, did you vote? And if you tell me you didn't vote, then we can end our discussion. Don't even talk to me again. There's nothing, what is there to talk about? Okay? I mean that. I mean, there is nothing that any person, you can walk around and carry 1,000 protest banners. You can engage in 1,000 protest marches, and you can show how courageous you are in opposing authority. That's great. But if you don't exercise the right to vote, all that is meaningless.
I couldn't agree more with you. This is why I asked you the question. In fact, in Chile, we were able to transition from a dictatorship to a democracy because of voting.
Yes,
because
yes,
of the process, because of the act of voting. So I think it's the most powerful right that we should make sure that our students, that our young generations actually understand how difficult it was to gain that right around the world. So,
and there were people, there are people you don't know about, people like, maybe you do know, you know about John Lewis, okay? But there are people like Vernon Johns, there were people like Medgar Evers, there were people like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer. And then, of course, there was the civil rights voting effort in 1964, where 3 civil rights workers were killed by the Klan. Why were they killed by the Klan? Because they were there. Two white Jewish boys and Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, and then a black resident person from Mississippi, James Chaney. They were viciously killed by the Klan. Why were they killed? Because they were trying to register Negroes to vote. Okay? The thing that persons in power who want to keep power and who do not want to give access to the ability to change power, the thing that they want most is for you not to vote. Okay? And the thing that's so crazy, sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Go ahead, finish.
Yes, I believe Christina has also more questions, basically about what's going on today in the United States, about the current protests and all the movements for more equality and racial equality in the United States. So I will maybe give a pass to her so she can continue with the
Okay, please
interview.
do.
Otherwise, I will be here forever with you, asking you about the civil rights movements.
That's
and
all
the
right.
so
I'm
I
very
have
honored.
to. I
I'm
have to
very honored.
refrain myself.
Okay. So now I have to keep my health and live long enough and get over the COVID pandemic so that I can lift my personal ban that I've had for not going to Chile because of the former Pinochet government. I've now overcome that. So someday I hope maybe I won't be able to do it, but Chile is a great country.
Thank you so much. I hope you will be able to come here shortly. We will have a vaccine and we will be able to travel again. So hope is always present.
Only if I come, you better have the best wine waiting for me at the airport when I arrive.
We will always have that. That's understanding. Yes, of course.
Oh, well, so regarding the right to vote, last week, President Trump suggested the idea to postpone the election. So how do you see that?
How do I see that?
It was as something unprecedented that the fact of suggesting that.
How do I see that? I see that on its most charitable way. I see it as someone who is just uninformed and simply not knowledgeable about the history and operations of the own government, that he's the president. You just cannot unilaterally do that. The Congress, it's been written and enshrined as part of our national law when the presidential election takes place. You just cannot decide, well, I'm not going to have it. And so I don't mean to offend you, but I don't want to dignify his statements are the words of an idiot. All right. I mean, it doesn't have elementary knowledge of the country of which he is president. Okay. But his intent is to denigrate the current system of voting, and particularly he's fearful. It's like voting by mail is like the pandemic. To him, voting by mail is like it's a disease. How dare? I mean, you vote by mail. You're going to infect the democratic process. And so that which he fears, I'm philosophically, I'm a scholar of Hegel. I always think that which he fears, I always think of the opposite. If he's so afraid of it, then it must be good.
Well, and also I'd like to ask you, the killing of George Floyd triggered huge protests in the United States. Do you think this could lead a change? And if you see this movement different compared to what happens in the 90s and different protests in the past?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. I said, when I've had an opportunity to write, when I can, or to speak directly to some of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, I want you to understand, and I want you to hear it from me, from someone who worked so closely with the singular greatest leader of the 20th century civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What the Black Lives Matter movement has achieved has been qualitatively transformative. They have brought together a coalition of persons of different colors and sexes that is so much greater and broader than we were able to achieve. So let me just say, even at the height of our civil rights movement, it was always substantially an African-American base-led movement with the participation of some very dedicated white people in America. And most of those white people, by the way, were Jewish. in America who came to our side and worked with us. But today, the fact, this is a demographic fact. This is the first movement I have seen around an issue as framed as Black Lives Matter, where the majority of people participating are not Black, but white and brown and Asian. While it's called the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Lives Matter movement as a fact, while it is a leadership component, it is a minority of it. The overwhelming majority of people who support it are not Black. It's a movement that you have the largest percentage participation of white people in a social movement that has ever occurred in the history of the United States, period.
And if you can explain after, why this kind of racism and these attitudes, the police towards African American continues happening, because we've seen it's always, it happens frequently. So I've talked to analysts, and they all say that the racism is actually indexed in the American society. Do you agree with this?
Well, let me just say this, and I don't want to get professorial as a professor, but there was a major, compelling social political document issued by something called the Kerner Commission in 1968, following the riots that occurred across the United States. And in that Kerner Commission report, it said that America was developing into two societies, one Black and one white. But within the findings of the Kerner Commission report, the findings were exactly what we're experiencing today. The central issue, aside from economic disparity, was the police. The police, the interaction of police in African American communities was that component in the Black-white race relations that was the most explosive. So what do we find? What do we find? You mentioned George Floyd. What kind of country with a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution and a Bill of Rights, what kind of country that proclaims itself as the beacon of human rights and civil rights in the world, what kind of country has a police force that arrests a man and put their knee on his head for 8 minutes and 46 seconds when they already have him under arrest? They already have him in police terms, under arrest. What kind of country does that? What kind of country permits their officers acting in the name of the state to do that to other human beings? What kind of country does that? That's what ignited. That's why the Black Lives Matter movement has sparked the largest participation of non-Black people in the history of the country, because it forced the country to say to itself, okay, in 1963, we remember seeing young Black boys and girls being bitten by dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham. And yes, we remember John Lewis walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but Jose Williams and other people being beaten and trampled by horses. But hold on, in 2020, is this really America? Is this can it really be that the most powerful country in the world, with its vaunted called military might, and its great economic power. Is this a country that does this to its people? And that's why, as I said, more powerful than the march of mighty armies, okay, are words. But in this case, it's words and pictures. That picture is the equivalent of Emile Zola's 6,000 words. It's equivalent to, that picture is equivalent to the Communist Manifesto. That picture is equivalent to the great historic document. That picture just says it all. You don't need an explanation. It speaks for itself. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to, a 17 or a 5, 10-year-old white, black, brown, Asian child can see that, and they can ask their parents, Mommy, why did they do that to that man? I mean, that goes to the heart of not just democracy, it goes to the heart of a country that does the United States have a moral core or not? Can we say as a country that there is a common set of values and morality? Can we say that there is something, It's like this is what shocked people in the history about Hitler Germany. Nobody can believe that an organized state government in Germany could organize its political and military power to exterminate 6 million people who were Jews. Nobody can believe that. Nobody could believe when they went into the gas chambers and found out what was being done to the Jews. They couldn't believe that other human beings would do this to other human beings. So George Floyd's, those cops kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, is just another call to the conscience of the country that says, just what kind of country are we? And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement has been so successful.
I would like to ask you also about Biden and the fact that he's could be have an African-American woman as a running mate. How important this is? Do you think this is an electoral option, or in order to attract more African-Americans to vote for him?
Well, it is said, is reported, he himself apparently has said that he is considering, he wants to have an African-American woman as his vice president. See, I'm a political pragmatist. And so I don't impute, I don't know what vice president, I don't know what candidate George Biden has in mind, but George Biden can read and he can count, okay? So I want you to hear it from me. There is no way possible that the Democratic Party can be successful unless they attract an outpouring of the base of its voter support. And that base is African American voters and white women particularly, and Asians and Hispanics, but particularly African Americans. I'm just telling you, I'm speaking politically to you, okay? Okay. Joe Biden may think that his background, as being vice president, got him elected to the Democratic nomination. No, it was Black voters. I want you to listen to me carefully. It was Black voters. And so he's smart enough. He's politically smart enough. He says, well, I want to ensure that I have an opportunity to win. So I don't know who he's going to choose, but it would be wise for him to choose a Black woman to be on the ticket if he wants to get the highest turnout of Black voters.
Can I add something?
Yes.
That in my view, Black women have been very active in the Democratic Party. So they have a very loyal constituency. Like, yes. I think they voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. So
let me tell you.
They have something extremely important, so they have to get that back.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't know how much time we have, but I just want to tell you there was a senator from Alabama by the name of Doug Jones, okay, who opposed this idiot who rose on horseback, some judge. Doug Jones was elected to the Senate from Alabama by the highest turnout of African-American voters in the history of Alabama when he ran. Now, I know Lowndes County. Lowndes County is where the Edmund Pettus Bridge is. Lowndes County is where Selma is, okay? Now, what candidate gets 97%? No candidate gets 97% of the African-American vote in Lowndes County. And you know who drove that vote? African-American women. Doug Jones knows that he was elected because of African-American women. And Joe Biden is not stupid, okay?
Can I ask one more question? Do we still have time? Or?
Yes.
I would like to ask you about the white supremacist movements. I've talked to many people, and they have raised, many analysts have raised awareness about this issue, that it's getting bigger. And I would like to know what's your perspective of this. How do you see this, the white supremacist movement?
Well, you were probably going to not be prepared for what I'm going to tell you. You see, remember how I opened this discussion and I talked to you about the character of the United States, founded on the institution of slavery and white supremacy? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, the doctrine of white supremacy as an ideology has been so pernicious and a part of every political, cultural institution in America that the real question to be asked is that how is it possible? How is it possible for a white person, a white child to be born in this country in the absence of other compelling evidence to teach it otherwise? It's more likely than that not that child could come to believe that, I've been gifted with this white skin, and I see that, I'm being treated differently than so forth. That's what we have. We have the legacy of white supremacy. And unfortunately, cultural institutions, the government institutions, have been unwilling to forthrightly confront it. That's my belief. And there will be no fundamental transformative period on the issue of race in America unless the country understands that this ideology of white supremacy is like deeply embedded into everything, every part of our culture, every part of our institutions. And we have to confront that. And so that an otherwise nice, beautiful white child, male or female, they grow up. People are not born with prejudice. They are taught, they are conditioned. How is it? How is it that a child comes into the world and then suddenly they don't know, they love their parents and so on. How is it that somewhere along the way they get conditioned to believe, oh, that person with that different color skin, or maybe I don't have the same skin, that they're not as good. How do they come to think that? They come to think that because it's so deeply embedded in our culture. That's why. And nobody is affirmatively wants to talk about it or do anything about it. Okay? That's why some scientists should invent some lifelong pills so I can live for another 100 years. So I can be a pain in the ass to everybody.
Well, I'd like to ask you the last question. There is this whole movement about defund the police. Also, President Obama did a whole plan to actually reform police, but nothing happens with that plan, it seems. And so I would like to know, do you think it's by defunding the police, is that the right way? What has to be done in the police departments in the United States in order to prevent the other cases of George Floyd?
I understand deeply what is meant by defunding the police. They're really asking for accountability. They're looking at it in a shorthand way. Well, how do we able to control the police? Well, okay. We know that in this society, money talks. Okay, so we don't give them money. They can't go about continuing to perpetuate what we saw with George Floyd. So they're thinking constructively. Take the money away from them, then they can't do those bad things. All right. So in that sense, it is constructive political thinking. But in terms of a slogan, it is not. Because people, you don't want to defund the police. African-American communities, particularly, and other communities, you want to fund the police. You don't want to defund them, but you want to fund them with accountability. You want to fund them where they don't determine how those funds are used, but the political power for whom they serve determines those funds. You need to have police. You need to have police who are funded. But defunding is unfortunately, I think, a politically ill-chosen, ill-advised word. But I understand the content, all right? You don't want to defund the police, no. You want to fund the police with accountability.
They're asking me to close because it seems that we don't have more time.
Okay.
So I just want to say just a couple of things. First, that the last question is very also important for Latin America. Police brutality, as it is in the United States, is also a major violation here in Chile and in the rest of Latin America. So I think we should continue to focus on this notion on how important it is to have a police reform, and a police reform that actually believes in human rights, but that really believe and implement that.
The police are agents of the state. The police are agents of power of the state. So when police are acting, they are acting in the name and under the authority of the state, of the political system. So there's no other way to look at it.
So let me thank you, Dr. Clarence, once again. I believe that social justice and the search for equality is something that we have in common in the whole of the Americas.
Yes, yes.
And hopefully we can continue our conversation in the near future. We truly enjoy the debate and get to know a little bit more about the civil rights movement and what is going on in terms of race relations in the United States today. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's my honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Not a problem. Thank you.